All right, guys. So I'm going to cover the remainder of the notes for chapter 16 for you guys. You guys can go back and then cover these notes or write them down for yourselves. So we left off with solid biomass. So right here, you can see these are the advantages, disadvantages of solid biomass. Uh, One of the big things with solid biomass is that we are able to replant and restore, uh, especially some degraded areas. So it is a renewable resource, but obviously it's going to take time for it to replenish itself. Uh, on the flip side of that, when we're cutting those down, it can and does contribute to deforestation, and especially in less developed areas, tropical regions in particular. And then you obviously have some of these other issues as well, but in particular, the CO2 emissions, the combination of burning the biomass, releasing CO2, and then removing the trees, which are a source of actually absorbing carbon dioxide. It's kind of two negative things happening there. So, biodiesel. So, we're going to talk about two types of biofuels biodiesel, and then we'll talk a little bit about ethanol. So biodiesel can be produced from various types of crops. Not necessarily we're going to focus on any one in particular, but just something to know is that biodiesel, it does require large amounts of land because you're essentially harvesting some of the main industrialized crops that also feed us. So, it's tricky because you also need fossil fuels to for the industrialized agriculture part of things. There's a lot of energy that goes into getting the crops to where they need to be, harvesting them, processing the biodiesel, and so it's not quite as efficient or sustainable as we would like to think sometimes. Ethanol is a whole another category. It's just the actual type of fuel you get from it versus biodiesel. And ethanol can be made from various things as well. The three that you see here on the screen: sugarcane, corn, switchgrass, three of the most common. U.S. by volume is the largest producer, but not necessarily the largest user. Brazil is the second largest producer, but has a much higher percentage of their vehicles that actually run off of ethanol. I know this one says 45% here. It's probably now 50%. And they have a goal. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know that they have a goal of a certain number of vehicles running off of ethanol in their future. So, liquid biofuels, advantages and disadvantages, just like anything else. Reduce CO2 emissions for some crops. It depends on what it is, depends on how they're being grown, harvested, all that type of stuff. Medium net energy, for biodiesel from oil palms, medium net energy from ethanol. So those are good things. The biggest disadvantages is that we're almost encouraging more agriculture, industrialized agriculture. We're also creating some competition for food, not only for us, but some of the livestock that we feed. So it gets a little bit tricky there. All right, geothermal energy. So we had a group do geothermal energy as a presentation. And I know you guys didn't get to see that real closely. But one of the big things to know about geothermal energy, and I guess one of the biggest drawbacks, is it's only easily available at certain places. There are places, for example, Iceland, where they have quite a bit of their energy that they get from geothermal energy. They're not necessarily the biggest producer, but they're also a very small country. So, therefore, the percentage of their electricity, their energy that comes from it, is pretty high. So, basically, what we do is in tapping into geothermal energy, we're looking at fluids in the Earth's mantle. We're looking at heat that is naturally sitting there in the Earth. And in some places, that's closer to the surface of the Earth than others. And so the closer it is, the easier it is for us to take advantage of it, the cheaper it is, the more efficient it ends up being. So, geothermal heat pump system, energy efficient, reliable, super clean, uh, and very cost effective, depending on obviously the size of the country and the capabilities of spreading this stuff around. But for somewhere like Iceland, it's easy. For the United States, it's a little bit trickier. We do produce quite a bit of geothermal energy. However, we also have a much higher energy demand than Iceland does. So hydrothermal reservoirs, that's kind of what you're looking for when you're looking for sites to mine, so to speak, for geothermal energy. You drill wells, you extract various steams, water. The U.S. is actually the largest producer, but Iceland, like I said, has the largest percentage of the country's energy that comes from geothermal. Some of the big problems with geothermal energy is the high cost of actually the infrastructure to build these geothermal systems. That's one of the big downsides of geothermal energy. But once it's in place, it's like any of the other renewable energy sources, it's pretty efficient. The other thing, dry or wet steam geothermal reservoirs could be depleted. So in some places, they actually send fluids down. They get heated up, they recollect them, and then they come up. In other places, they're actually extracting that dry or wet steam. And in those places, there is the potential for them to be depleted. All right, this gives you a little idea of, what does this whole thing look like? And this is a simple diagram, so it gives you a pretty good idea of how this thing works. So hot water is steamed, is pumped under pressure to the surface from underground. So you've got these collecting ducts that bring this stuff up, and you can see this is labeled as a heat exchanger. Essentially what this is where these fluids pumped up from underground are going to transfer their heat to water that's going to produce steam that's going to turn this turbine. That turbine, in turn, is going to turn a generator just like any other power plant. And that's where you're going to actually produce your electricity. The steam from the turbine condenses and is pumped back down into the geothermal reservoir. And then again, obviously, it's going to be recirculated, so to speak, from down there. So advantages, disadvantages of geothermal. Medium net energy. Anytime you get it into medium and high, you're talking about something that's realistic for the future to be a energy source in the long run. Lower CO2 emissions. This is kind of the same as any of the renewable energies in that a lot of the carbon dioxide emissions come in the construction, manufacturing, building of the plant itself, and then some of the maintenance. But outside of that, there isn't really CO2 emissions in the actual production of energy. This says low cost at favorable sites. I would say lower cost at favorable sites. Not necessarily is it cheap to build a geothermal power plant and take advantage of it. High cost except at concentrated and accessible sites. That's for most of them are pretty high cost. Scarcity of suitable sites. That's one of the biggest downsides of geothermal is you can almost take advantage of it anywhere, but in some cases it's just not cost effective. Noise, some CO2 emissions, those are pretty minimal in the big scheme of things. All right, hydrogen. So I believe this is our last fuel, but hydrogen is a clean energy source as long as it's not produced with the use of fossil fuels. However, currently it has a negative net energy yield, meaning that we have to put more energy into producing hydrogen than we're actually getting out of it at this point. And really, the most cost-effective way of producing it is when it is driven by fossil fuels. So hydrogen is one of those things where we really need to find a way to get renewable energy to produce our hydrogen that we can then use as a fuel source. So hydrogen is kind of pitched as that potentially that fuel of the future, and it's here. There are production vehicles in place. You can buy a hydrogen fuel cell car. In a urban area, a metropolitan area, it's much more accessible to get hydrogen than it is somewhere like Temecula in the suburbs. It's just you don't really have that kind of stuff. So, but it eliminates most of the air pollution problems. It does reduce the threats of global warming because you're really producing just water as waste. And this is how it is harvested. So, or methods of harvesting it, these four. So you can pass electricity through water, strip it from methane, remove it chemically from coal, and you can take it from gasoline molecules. All right, this recording is about to end. I will finish the rest in a second recording.